when Barron Trump gave up his first-class seat to an elderly veteran. No one anticipated the extraordinary family story that would unfold during the flight. What happened next left the entire plane in awe. The cabin lights flickered softly as passengers settled into their seats, the usual hum of pre-flight anticipation filling the air. It was a crisp morning at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport, and Flight 247 to Newark was full. Among the crowd was a young man seated in first class, a recognizable figure, though his demeanor suggested a desire for privacy. Barron Trump, now a tall teenager, sat quietly by the window, flipping through a hardcover book. Unlike his family, who often made headlines, he preferred to avoid the spotlight. However, his name on the boarding pass ensured attention. Across the aisle, an elderly man in his late 70s shuffled into the economy section. His silver hair was neatly combed, his back slightly hunched, and his pace deliberate as he carried an aged leather duffel bag. Passengers exchanged glances as the man passed by. His military jacket, adorned with faded patches and medals, told a story of service and sacrifice. Some whispered about his past, while others admired the quiet dignity in his stride. He took his seat near the rear of the plane, squeezed between a chatty businessman and a restless toddler. Meanwhile, flight attendants moved briskly through the aisles, ensuring everyone was settled for takeoff. Just as the cabin door closed, a ripple of tension coursed through the air. The elderly veteran's seatmate became visibly upset, insisting he needed a different seat. As the veteran apologized for the inconvenience, the commotion drew Barron's attention away from his comfortable spot in first class. Barron watched the scene unfold, leaning slightly into the aisle, his brows furrowing in thought. Without a word, he pressed the call button for a flight attendant. "Excuse me," Barron said softly when she arrived. "Can I switch seats with the gentleman in the military jacket?" The flight attendant blinked in surprise. Passengers in first class glanced up from their newspapers and tablets. Their curiosity piqued. Barron's offer was unexpected, especially in a world where privilege often went unchallenged. Yet, his expression was earnest, and his tone left no room for negotiation. "Let me check," the attendant replied, her voice carrying a note of astonishment as she walked briskly toward the back of the plane. As Barron stood to grab his carry-on, murmurs in first class grew louder. A woman across the aisle leaned toward him. "You don't have to do that. You know, you paid for this seat," she said, her voice tinged with confusion. Barron simply smiled and shrugged. Some people deserve it more. What happened next would shift the atmosphere of the entire flight. The flight attendant returned moments later, her expression a mix of curiosity and admiration. "He said he'd be happy to switch," she informed Barron, her voice carrying a slight tremor. It wasn't every day someone voluntarily gave up a first-class seat, let alone a teenager with a name that turned heads. Barron smiled politely and nodded, grabbing his bag before making his way down the narrow aisle. Passengers whispered as he passed, some nudging each other to confirm what they were witnessing. A few even reached for their phones, discreetly snapping photos. Barron seemed unaffected by the attention, his focus solely on the man now seated near the back. When Barron arrived, the elderly veteran looked up, confused. "Are you sure, young man?" he asked, his voice weathered but firm. "You don't have to do this for me." "I want to," Barron replied, extending a hand. "Thank you for your service. Please, take my seat." The veteran hesitated for a moment, as if debating whether to accept the gesture. But the sincerity in Barron's eyes was undeniable. Slowly, the man stood, shaking Barron's hand firmly. "Well, thank you. That's a mighty kind of you." As the veteran made his way to first class, murmurs among the passengers grew louder. A young mother in row 15 whispered to her teenage daughter, "Did you see that? He just gave up his seat." The businessman seated next to Barron looked over, raising an eyebrow. "Never seen anything like that on a flight," he muttered, half to himself. Barron slid into the now-vacant economy seat, adjusting his tall frame to fit the tighter space. He seemed completely at ease, ignoring the scattered stares from fellow passengers. A flight attendant passed by and discreetly asked if he needed anything, but Barron simply shook his head and opened his book again. In first class, the veteran settled into the plush seat, visibly overwhelmed by the comfort and unexpected kindness. He adjusted the armrest, his hands trembling slightly. A flight attendant approached him, offering a complimentary drink and a warm blanket. "The young man said you should have this seat," she explained. The veteran smiled faintly. "It's been years since I've been treated like this," he murmured. He glanced back toward the economy section, where Barron sat calmly, now absorbed in his book. The gesture had been small in action, but monumental in its impact. For a moment, the cabin seemed to exhale as the tension of boarding dissipated. The passengers settled in, and the plane taxied onto the runway. But as the engines roared to life and the flight lifted into the air, the story was far from over. As the flight reached cruising altitude, the soft hum of the engines filled the cabin. Flight attendants moved through the aisles with drinks and snacks. But the atmosphere was anything but routine. Passengers couldn't stop glancing between Barron Trump in the economy section and the elderly veteran now seated in first class. Whispers of admiration spread, but the story was only beginning to unfold. The veteran sat quietly at first, sipping his water and staring out the window, his hands resting on his lap with the faintest tremor visible. Then, as if compelled by the weight of the moment, he turned to the passenger seated next to him, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes. "I have to say something," he began, his voice just loud enough to be heard. The woman looked at him, curious. The veteran adjusted the small pin on his lapel, a purple heart, and sighed deeply. "That young man who gave me this seat, his family saved my life once." The woman blinked, surprised. "What do you mean?" The veteran leaned back, his voice growing steadier as he began his story. "It was decades ago, during the war. I was stationed overseas, far from home, with no family support. I'd been injured badly, shot twice in the leg. When I finally got stateside, I was lost. No direction, no purpose, nothing." His voice wavered, but he continued. "I ended up in New York, trying to rebuild my life. I didn't have a place to stay, barely enough money for food. One day, I ran into a man outside a diner who saw me struggling. He didn't just hand me $1 and walk away. He sat with me, listened to my story. That man was Donald Trump's father, Fred." The woman's eyes widened, and a few passengers nearby, who had been subtly eavesdropping, leaned closer. "Fred Trump?" she asked. The veteran nodded, his expression growing wistful. "Yes, he didn't owe me a thing, but he made sure I had a roof over my head and a job to get back on my feet. He never asked for anything in return, just told me, 'You served this country. It's the least we can do.' I'll never forget those words." By now, the conversation had caught the attention of several passengers in first class, and the story began to ripple through the cabin. The veteran's voice grew stronger as he continued, his eyes misting with gratitude. "I always wanted to thank his family, but I never got the chance. Life moved on, and I thought the moment was lost forever. And now, today, that man's grandson has given me a gift I'll never forget. What are the odds of something like this happening?" In economy, Barron sat oblivious to the growing buzz around the plane. He was engrossed in his book, his long legs awkwardly tucked into the cramped space. But in first class, the veteran's revelation had sparked something deeper. Passengers began to exchange glances, murmurs of amazement spreading like wildfire. One of the flight attendants leaned toward the veteran. "Would you like me to tell him what you just shared?" she asked softly. The veteran hesitated, then shook his head. "No, not yet. Let the boy have his piece. He doesn't need to know how much this means to me. Not right now." But the passengers couldn't contain their astonishment. What had started as a simple act of kindness now carried a sense of destiny, as if the universe had aligned just for this moment. As the plane continued its steady journey through the skies, the atmosphere in the cabin seemed to shift. What had begun as an ordinary flight had transformed into something much more meaningful, a shared moment of reflection and connection among strangers. The veteran sat quietly for a few moments, his story lingering in the air like an unspoken challenge. Nearby passengers exchanged glances, some leaning closer to share their own thoughts in hushed tones. It was the man seated directly across from the veteran who broke the silence. He appeared to be in his early 40s, with a tired but approachable face. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "But your story really hit home. My grandfather served in Vietnam too. He used to talk about how much it meant when people back home cared enough to help. Hearing what Fred Trump did for you, well, that's rare. Too rare." The veteran nodded, his lips curling into a faint smile. "It's the little things, son. People don't realize how far a small act of kindness can go. Back then, I thought my life was over, but that man's generosity gave me a second chance." Across the aisle, a young mother chimed in, cradling a sleeping toddler in her arms. "You know, my dad used to say the same thing. He wasn't a veteran, but he always told me that when someone lifts you up, even just a little, you pass it on. It's like a chain reaction. What Barron did today, It's proof that kindness still matters. The veteran's eyes softened as he listened. It's true, he said. And it's not just about big gestures. Sometimes, just being seen, being acknowledged, can change everything. That's what Fred Trump did for me. And it's what his grandson has done for me again today. The passengers continued to share their stories, each one more heartfelt than the last. A flight attendant, visibly moved, sat on the armrest of an empty seat near the veteran. I wasn't planning to say anything, she admitted, but my brother served in Iraq. He didn't talk much about it, but when he came home, he told me that the people who stopped to thank him or help him out in small ways, those were the moments that stuck with him. Sometimes, those moments were the only thing keeping him going. The veteran nodded in understanding, his expression a mix of empathy and quiet pride. Your brother's right. It's the little things that keep you grounded when everything else feels like it's falling apart. In economy, Barron noticed a few passengers glancing back at him, their faces a mixture of awe and gratitude. He didn't understand the full context of what was happening yet, but he offered a polite nod to one woman who smiled at him. His gesture, though small, had set off a cascade of reflections and connections that no one on that flight could have predicted. As the plane touched down in Newark, the veteran stood, preparing to disembark. To everyone's surprise, he walked directly to the economy section, scanning the rows until his gaze landed on Barron. The young man, now standing to retrieve his bag, looked up in surprise. The veteran extended a hand. Young man, I wanted to thank you face to face. What you did today, it brought me full circle. Your family has a history of kindness, and you've carried that forward. Never forget how much these moments matter. Barron shook his hand firmly, his voice steady but quiet. I didn't do anything special. Sir, you deserved it. The cabin was silent now, passengers watching the exchange unfold with rapt attention. Some had tears in their eyes. Others wore small, thoughtful smiles. The connection between these two men, generations apart, felt like a living testament to the power of empathy and gratitude. As the passengers disembarked, many paused to thank Barron for his gesture. Others approached the veteran, offering handshakes and words of gratitude for his service. The mood was unlike anything anyone had experienced on a flight before. At the gate, the veteran turned once more before leaving, tipping his hat toward Barron. You've got a good heart, son. Don't ever lose that. Barron nodded, his usual reserved demeanor softening just enough to show the impact of the words. As he walked toward the baggage claim, he pulled out his phone and typed a brief message. He hesitated, then hit send. The text read, Grandpa would have been proud of today. As Barron continued through the airport toward baggage claim, his phone buzzed almost immediately. Several messages poured in from friends, family members, and even strangers who had witnessed the event through social media. Among them was a simple message from his mother. You've always been grounded, Barron. Today, you showed that. We're proud of you. There were also messages from individuals who shared their own stories of gratitude and kindness. A middle-aged woman wrote, Your gesture reminded me of when my father helped a fellow veteran at the airport once. It's amazing how kindness can ripple through generations. Another message from a man read, My grandfather served with your grandfather. It meant a lot to see the continuation of that spirit. Barron sat quietly on a bench near the baggage carousel, reading through each message thoughtfully. The words were humbling, yet expected. His family had always taught him the value of service. But today was different. It wasn't about politics or privilege. It was about simple, human decency. The veteran's words echoed in his mind. You've got a good heart, son. Don't ever lose that. And with that, Barron Trump boarded a cab, his focus shifting toward a future where small acts of kindness continued to make a big difference. As the cab pulled away from the airport, Barron gazed out the window, his thoughts quietly swirling. The events of the day left him introspective, reflecting on the unexpected moments of connection and the powerful message they carried. The city streets passed by in a blur, but his mind remained anchored in the meaningful exchange that had unfolded earlier. Throughout the drive, memories of the veteran's story replayed in his mind. The sacrifices, the kindness extended by his family, and the ripple effect of those small gestures. It wasn't just about giving up a seat. It was about recognizing the humanity in others, especially those who had given so much for their country. When Barron arrived at his family's residence in the city, the house was quiet. His father, Donald Trump, had been away on business, and his mother, Melania, was tending to a charity event downtown. Only his siblings, Tiffany and Eric, were home, both preoccupied with school and work. After settling into his room, Barron pulled out his phone again. This time, he opened a private chat with his mother, reflecting on the day. Today was special. He wrote simply, a reminder that kindness doesn't go unnoticed. Melania responded quickly. It's in moments like these that we learn the most. Your grandfather would have been proud. For a while, Barron stared at the screen. The words comforting. He knew that his grandfather, Fred Trump, had instilled values of integrity and service into his family long before Barron was born. Today, those values were given new life through a simple act, a gesture that carried more meaning than he could have anticipated. Later that evening, Barron joined his siblings in the living room. They were discussing their days, but soon the conversation turned to the flight incident. Tiffany smiled thoughtfully. I heard about what happened. Dad was proud. He said it reminded him of Grandpa Fred. Eric nodded in agreement. Yeah, we talked about it earlier. Dad was really touched by the story, even though you didn't do it for attention. It resonated in ways we didn't expect. Barron listened quietly, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. It wasn't often his family spoke openly about moments of genuine compassion, but tonight, the atmosphere felt different, heavier with meaning. Tiffany shifted in her seat. You know, after everything that happened today, I called one of my professors at NYU. I've been working on a community service project for veterans. Hearing that story inspired me to take it more seriously. Eric leaned back against the couch, thoughtfully tapping his fingers on his knee. It's crazy how something so simple can spark that. Dad's always emphasized business, but today was a reminder that it's about more than just success. It's about legacy, what we leave behind for others. Barron smiled, grateful for the open conversation. Exactly. It's not just about helping others when they need it. It's about making sure those moments aren't forgotten, that they become part of who we are. The conversation continued into the evening, each of them sharing thoughts on how small acts of kindness could create lasting change. Barron, still processing the day's events, felt a renewed sense of purpose. His family legacy, rich with stories of philanthropy and service, had been quietly woven into his own identity, shaping how he viewed the world. The following weeks saw a quiet ripple effect. Barron began engaging more openly in community events, not just because it was expected, but because he wanted to. His involvement in initiatives supporting veterans increased, and he even began working on a small mentorship program for underprivileged youth. Word spread about his involvement, and soon, stories of Barron's efforts made their way to local news outlets and social media. It wasn't just his name being mentioned, it was his actions. The message was clear: actions of kindness, no matter how small, can create a lasting impact. One afternoon, while attending a fundraiser for a local veterans organization, a reporter approached Barron with a microphone. Mr. Trump, she said, what inspired you to take such an active role in community service? You don't have to do this. Barron paused, a gentle smile on his face. You're right. I don't have to, but I've realized that we all have a responsibility to give back. My family has been fortunate in so many ways, and I've learned that true success isn't just about personal achievements. It's about making a positive difference in the world. The reporter nodded thoughtfully, her expression softening. It's rare to hear someone so young speaking with such conviction. Barron shrugged. It's not about age. It's about understanding that the small moments, those quiet, unsung acts, are often the most meaningful. As the crowd clapped in agreement, Barron's reflection deepened. The flight, the veteran, the simple gesture, those moments had shifted something fundamental within him. They reminded him that connections built on empathy, service, and shared humanity endure far beyond a single day. And so, with every passing day, Barron continued his journey of service, grounding his actions in the values his family had passed down. For him, it wasn't just about the legacy. It was about ensuring that the legacy lived on through the lives he touched. The legacy wasn't something Barron could touch or hold, but it was something he could nurture, an idea that grew with each person he reached, each story shared, and each conversation that opened minds. In every act, no matter how small, he saw the ripple effect begin to spread, connecting him to something larger than himself. Word of his involvement traveled beyond local circles, eventually catching the attention of national organizations focused on veterans affairs and youth empowerment. Invitations poured in for Barron to participate in panels, discussions, and initiatives that addressed critical social issues. Though initially reluctant to step into the public spotlight, he embraced the opportunities with purpose, determined to use his platform for good. At one such event, a symposium for emerging leaders in social impact, Barron found himself seated alongside accomplished activists, educators, and business leaders. The room was alive with dialogue, and every speaker shared insights on how personal action could drive systemic change. Barron listened intently, absorbing perspectives and ideas from individuals who had dedicated their lives to causes he now felt deeply connected to. After a particularly powerful session led by a disabled veteran who had turned his struggles into advocacy for accessible education, Barron was inspired to share his own journey. "I never thought that a single act could lead me down this path," he began, his voice steady and reflective. "But once it did, I realized the responsibility we all have to make sure those moments aren't lost in the noise of the world. Every small step, every act of kindness, builds a foundation for something greater." The audience responded with nods and applause. And it wasn't just admiration. They recognized the authenticity in his words. Barron wasn't speaking from a place of obligation or familial expectation. He was speaking from a personal truth that had emerged from his experiences. Over the months, Barron's involvement expanded. He began mentoring young activists and organizing youth leadership workshops focused on philanthropy and community service. His approach was simple yet profound: educate, empower, and inspire. By fostering spaces where young leaders could thrive, he helped cultivate a generation that was not only aware of social issues, but actively working to solve them. In private conversations, Barron often reflected on the journey that had led him to this point. His mother's guidance, the veteran's story, and the growing network of like-minded individuals had reshaped his understanding of purpose. He saw now how interconnected everything was, how acts of service could inspire others to act, and how the ripple effect could extend far beyond what one person could imagine. During a quiet afternoon at his family estate in Mar-a-Lago, Barron sat by the pool, flipping through old family albums. Each photo seemed to hold a story, a lesson, whether it was his grandparents' legacy in business or the stories of charity events his parents had supported. The weight of history settled over him, and yet, it wasn't daunting. It was empowering. He knew his role wasn't to simply carry the torch of his family's legacy, but to honor it through his own actions. One evening, as he attended a gala in Washington, D.C., Barron was introduced to a senator who had been following his work. "Mr. Trump," the senator said, shaking his hand warmly, "your commitment to community service is inspiring. It's a reminder that leadership comes in many forms, and yours is making a difference." Barron thanked him politely, reflecting on the senator's words. Leadership, he realized, wasn't just about making decisions in a boardroom or shaping policy from the Capitol. It was about the everyday choices that impacted people's lives, the choices to listen, to engage, to serve. In those moments, Barron felt a deeper sense of purpose than he had ever known. It wasn't about the spotlight or recognition. It was about creating something lasting, a legacy not of wealth or fame, but of meaningful change, built brick by brick through the actions of a thoughtful, compassionate individual. As he returned home that evening, the familiar warmth of family enveloped him once more. His siblings, parents, and close friends gathered around, sharing stories and dreams. Together, they continued to discuss how they could push forward, not just for personal success, but for a greater cause. And through it all, Barron's actions became a testament to the belief that every small effort, combined with a sincere heart, could alter the trajectory of a community, a generation, and even the world.